what are your thoughts as a psychiatrist, as an addiction expert on like marijuana and the brain and mental health?
What I would say to people, right, is if marijuana is contributing to your life being poor, how would you even tell? Right? That's the question. The same question that I would ask you and I would ask them. And if their answer is, I don't know, then that's a huge problem, because this is something that could be negatively impacting your life, but you may not be able to see it. And so then that becomes really, really tricky. Like, how do you know? Because if it is a problem and it is keeping you stuck, you wouldn't ever be able to see it, which means that you're never going to fix it, which means that your life will continue to stay exactly the way that it is. So usually what it requires is an extended period of sobriety as an experiment. What will happen to your life if you stop marijuana for like 6 months to a year? We're not talking 30 days. We're talking 6 months to a year. And if someone is not able to engage in that experiment, then that is a sign that there's a problem, because that's really how long it takes, in my experience, to really get out of a substance. But and so so that was kind of, I know, more directly answered your question. But now you're asking me, what do I think about marijuana? So I think there's a couple things to keep in mind about marijuana. So I think any substance or anything in the world, doesn't matter what it is, has certain good effects and certain bad effects, right? So I know this sounds weird, because even working as an addiction psychiatrist, a lot of people are anti-marijuana. There are some studies that show that marijuana can be beneficial. So one study of people who are dependent on opiates found that if you start using marijuana, you can cut your opiate dependency by about 50%. There are some studies, I've had some patients who have been able to use marijuana in a somewhat healthy way to manage, for example, like some aspects of depression or bipolar disorder or anxiety. And some people really find that it can be helpful. I think the challenge is that a lot of the things that people think marijuana do in a negative way is not what I usually see. So some people are worried. They'll say like, oh, like marijuana will make you like stupider and it'll lower your IQ. There's one study, for example, that shows that marijuana is associated with a 4 to 8 point decrease in IQ. But if you say something like that, people will say, but there are lots of very successful people who are super smart who are still using marijuana. Fair enough. There are other studies that show that it doesn't have too much of an effect. So there are a couple of things to keep in mind when it comes to marijuana. The first is that the majority of our studies on marijuana did happen before it was criminalized, at least in the United States, around the 60s and 70s. The marijuana that we get access to today is not the same substance that we got access to 60 years ago, because the potency has increased very, very intensely. So the THC concentration, some of these other compounds in it are way more concentrated, so we see a larger effect. So some of the studies that suggest that it's safe, we're talking about, 2 ounces of beer versus 2 ounces of liquor is a very different thing. And marijuana used to be the concentration of beer, and now it's the concentration of like hard liquor. Second thing is that there are a couple of real big problems with marijuana. The first is that it really is a gateway drug. So especially when you start using it in adolescence, one of the biggest problems that I see is that marijuana alters your reward circuitry and your vulnerability to other substances. It sensitizes your dopamine system so that your dopamine system becomes more vulnerable to other addictions. So like you'll actually become more vulnerable to things like video games and stuff like that. And literally like the enjoyment that you get from video games will become altered. The anticipation that you experience will increase. The craving that you will experience will actually intensify. So when you use marijuana, it becomes harder to resist cravings for all other things, because it literally alters the chemical structure of your brain and your neurons and stuff in the nucleus accumbens. There's very good evidence for that. So it's not so much the direct effect of marijuana, we'll get to those, but it's that it really makes it gives you a handicap in dealing with other addictive substances. So that's one thing. Okay, so marijuana is not the same concentration. Second thing is it really is a gateway drug in a negative way. The third thing that I really tend to find when I work with people is the reason that marijuana is a problem is not because it's harmful. The reason that marijuana is a problem is because it's helpful. So the hardest patients that I've had to work with as an addiction psychiatrist are not the ones where they use substances and it makes their life wonderful. The hardest cases to kick are when they use substances and it makes their life normal. And this is very true of marijuana. So when I work with people who use marijuana, the hardest cases are not, oh my God, I love marijuana, I love getting high, we're going to like celebrate and have fun and we're going to vibe. It's when I smoke marijuana or when I use marijuana, I get to live life the way that normal people do. I get to live an ordinary life. I get to hang out with people without crippling anxiety. I get to be able to go to sleep at night like other normal human beings. And this is the real challenge. This is why it's so good and why people like it so much is they do detect that it helps with things like social anxiety. It helps with things like sleep. And if you were to ask someone, hey, I'm going to give you two options. One is you can live a life where you don't get to sleep very much and your sleep is crappy and you get to wake up exhausted every day and you don't get to form social connections with people. You don't get to hang out with people. You don't get to date. Or you get to do all of those things. All you have to do is use marijuana. And by the way, it also enhances the pleasure of things like food and video games and sexual activity. Which one would you pick? Right? This is the real challenge, is that it helps people live what they perceive to be normal lives. And in many ways, it does help them live normal lives. So the challenge, though, is that when we start using marijuana to help with those things, it creates other downstream long-term effects. So marijuana may help you fall asleep, but it alters your sleep architecture. It alters your REM sleep. It alters your sleep cycles and makes that sleep less restful. And it also creates other kinds of problems like rebound anxiety. And over time, you develop tolerance. And it's sort of like a double-edged sword is really what I see, which is what makes it so dangerous. And then once you have something that becomes an easy way to fix a problem, then you stop focusing on fixing the problem in a more long-term or healthier way, right? The moment that I use marijuana every night before I go to sleep, sleep hygiene becomes less important. And so the real challenge with marijuana is that it allows you, because it works so well, it actually allows you to propagate unhealthy behaviors. Since it helps me relax and socialize, I don't ever build up my social skills. I don't work on my confidence. I don't go to the gym. I don't learn how to talk to people because the marijuana does everything for me. So marijuana does help. It's just, it's the taking the elevator instead of taking the stairs. So it works in the short term, but over time, it's going to make your life harder.
And is the same true for alcohol? Like, I mean, when I heard you describe like the life of, getting high on marijuana and how you're able to date, have fun, socialize, be with your friends, fall asleep faster, I feel like you're also describing the allure to alcohol as well.
Absolutely. Right. So I think alcohol in some ways, I think is like almost more damaging. So I think we have a much clearer relationship between alcohol usage numbing our emotions, especially things like sadness today, but worsens our mood over the course of the next week and the next month. So I think alcohol in some ways is like worse in the sense that the negative health impacts are quite profound, or quite, I don't know how to say this. They're more immediate and they seem to be more potent. But alcohol absolutely can serve as a social lubricant. I've even done like couples counseling where like the reason that these people got married in the first place is because of alcohol.
Wow.
And it's such a foundation for their relationship. Two people with social anxiety get together. They both enjoy drinking. They both have somewhat of a biological predisposition. And then when one of them gets sober later in life because it's causing all kinds of other problems, it really creates problems in their relationship because it is the foundation of some of their relationship, right? For their honeymoon, they're going to go like on a wine tasting thing in Napa Valley and all this kind of stuff. So it's absolutely true for alcohol as well.
Do you think people's lives will get worse faster if they abuse alcohol compared to marijuana?
I mean, that's such a dangerous question, but my gut instinct is yes. Like alcohol will screw up your life. This is just what I've seen as a clinician. This is an anecdotal experience, right? So, I mean, just simple things. So if we look at like, health consequences, it's not just that it'll happen faster, it's that it'll screw you up more. Right. So, hepatic steatosis, liver cirrhosis, drunk driving, alcohol withdrawal can be fatal, whereas like marijuana withdrawal is not fatal. Alcohol intoxication is much more likely to be like physically damaging and can be fatal, whereas marijuana intoxication has a much less likely chance of doing so. So from a cytotoxicity, which means the toxicity to your actual cells, I think that alcohol, I mean, we've got some strong evidence that alcohol in that way is worse.
Right.
And then all the people who like marijuana listening to this are going to be like, yeah, I'm in the same, it's okay.
I told you so. No, that's really what I meant, is that I think alcohol will screw your life up more, because it's like the argument is always like, well, I've never heard anybody's marriage get ruined because of X, Y, and Z, but alcohol has certainly destroyed marriages, or the driving part, or just how intense it is. And I think it's like, it's so odd to me that it's become so normalized socially, because it's like we wouldn't do the same thing with something like heroin, and heroin and alcohol, I mean, in my opinion, aren't that far apart as far as like the potential dangers of abusing them.
I think you can absolutely make that argument.
So what do you think is the remedy or the solution for all of this? Because as somebody who's been in recovery for over 15 years, I know that substances and external things like we've been talking about provide this an immense amount of value to our lives, and they're highly addictive, and the feeling is highly addictive. And at the same time, the further down the addiction path we go, the more shame we develop, and the lower our self-esteem becomes. So now you're at this horrible crossroads where you're highly addicted to something that makes you feel really good, and you feel like crap about yourself, and you have no confidence in your ability to change. So how does somebody handle that?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So that's the problem. The problem with the addiction is that when you're done with using, you create a worse situation that requires you to use. So you have a bunch of shame. So you need some kind of substance to make the shame go away. We absolutely see that going on with technology. So I would say, and this is kind of where I take like a yogic perspective, and I think there's a reason why, if you look at like the evolution of psychotherapy and psychiatry, basically there's something going on right now called the third wave of psychotherapy. The third wave of psychotherapy is the incorporation of certain like Eastern concepts into clinical treatment. So we have these things like dialectical behavioral therapy, which includes a lot of mindfulness. We have things like acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a very good evidence-based treatment for addictions. And so we're starting to incorporate some of these Eastern concepts. And I think the most important thing is that if we look at what all of these things do, what they do is externalize our attention. We spend less time with ourselves, and we spend more time with the outside world. And this is creating all kinds of other problems that we haven't even touched on. See, when I'm not in touch with myself, I don't know what I want. Right. And if I don't know what I want, what I end up doing is looking to the external world, looking for successful people. And then I say, okay, well, this person is happy, this person is successful, that's what I should do. And then we start to do that, but we don't actually feel that internally. We have a question mark in here, and we're looking for answers on the outside. And then once we start duplicating what that person is doing, then it doesn't work the same, because that person was passionate. That's why they got there. But I'm not passionate. I'm just mimicking what they're doing. So this is kind of what ends up happening, is we're kind of directionless in life. We don't really know what we want. And then in that directionlessness, our brain is kind of like, why not get some dopamine today? Because I'm not working towards anything in particular. And if you look at there's some really interesting multivariate regression analyses on risk factors for pornography addiction. So what correlates with pornography addiction? And the number one thing that I've sort of found in the literature doesn't say necessarily that this is number one, but this is what I think is really important. There's very strong correlation, is meaninglessness in life. And you know, I know you struggled with substances in the past. And if you really like look at every single person who's overcome an addiction, a big part of it is you have to have a really good reason to. You have to care more about fixing the addiction than what the addiction provides. And right now, we're such a purposeless society. It's like, what do I want to accomplish a year from now? Who the hell knows? Right? And then we go on like finding this answer from the outside, but we're not in touch with ourselves. And so I think the most important thing that needs to happen is we need to get back in touch with ourselves. Stop running away from our emotions, connect with what we want. Because when I work with people who are addicted to pornography, on any given day, it's just not worth it to avoid porn. It's not like they move towards something significant. The cost is not that high. I might as well watch a little bit of porn, maybe jerk off a little bit, maybe masturbate a little bit, and then I can go on to the empty life. You know, the life is empty before and the life is empty after. There's no cost, really. And so a big part of it, I think, is just re-internalizing our attention, connecting with ourselves, becoming like grounded. And this is something that I think is incredibly important because technology is only going to get more addictive. Like, it's not like one day some platform is going to wake up and say, oh, you know what? This is addictive enough. On the contrary, they're all competing for our attention. So what's happening right now is all the platforms are trying to pull users towards their platform and pull people away from other platforms, which is what they're designed to do. I mean, I don't think that's evil. It's just, anytime you have a marketplace, everyone wants you to use their product. That's their goal. The problem is no matter which platform wins, you lose because you're losing the attention no matter what. So what we really need to do is reconnect with ourselves, spend a little bit more time with ourselves, learn to work through emotions as opposed to numb them, right? Try to figure out what we want instead of letting social media tell us the ways in which we're deficient and how we can spend $59.99 to fix that problem, right? This is exactly what's going on. And so what we really need to do is get connected with ourselves because even social media will create things like body dysmorphia. Right? There's a really disturbing trend that we're seeing where body dysmorphia used to be more common in women, and we're starting to see equality between men and women. And men have a lot more body dysmorphia than I think historically they've ever had. And so that's all because we're making our sense of self is being dictated by what we consume from the outside. It's not being developed from in here.
Do you think that marijuana is not only psychologically addicting, but also physically addictive as well?
So this dichotomy between physical and psychological addiction is a funny one because psychological addiction is physical, right? I mean, this is all happening in our brains, and these are chemical changes and synaptic remodeling and all of that. But yes, I mean, there are these different dimensions of addiction. What happens a lot with cannabis is people will say, well, it's not addictive because when I stop, I don't have any withdrawal. Or people will say with alcohol addiction, well, I'm not addicted because I don't go into withdrawal when I stop alcohol, even though other people do. But this physical withdrawal is only one manifestation of withdrawal. I always like to say that the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance or behavior are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving. And I can tell you that most people who use cannabis daily who stop for a period of time will experience anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. So it's very clear that cannabis is addictive. It's very clear that it's both a physical behavior and a learned behavior. So some of this, chemical coping or habit formation, or just like the linked association between, oh, I feel better when I use cannabis. And so that's a learned association, right? But the problem is that learned association can get kind of calcified in our brains, where we have this sort of recall or memory for what the drug can do, even if it becomes very much at odds with what the drug actually does, right? So we have this idea, cannabis helps my anxiety, when it's clear that I've now reached a point where it's not actually helping my anxiety. And I'm way more anxious than I was 2 years ago when I started using cannabis to help my anxiety. So this is the kinds of things we need to draw patients' attention to, because it's very, very easy to lose cause and effect as we are chasing dopamine.
So going back to something you said a few minutes ago, where you said in the short term, like, yes, it can feel like something like marijuana or cannabis can be very helpful for something like anxiety, but in the long term, it can be quite detrimental. Why is that? Like, what does marijuana do to the brain for it to specifically impact the way we manage anxiety, we feel anxious and stuff like that?
Right. So cannabis works on our cannabinoid receptors, our anandamide receptors, our CB1 receptors specifically, which are widely distributed throughout the brain, and ultimately lead to this final common pathway of releasing dopamine in our brain's reward and motivation circuits. What happens basically all human organisms have a drive toward homeostasis, right? Or whatever our baseline level of anandamide, that's our endogenous cannabis, the ones that we make in our brain, our endogenous anandamide transmission, our endogenous dopamine transmission. We all have kind of like a baseline level of firing of these essential hormones and neurotransmitters. That's called homeostasis. And one of the universal principles governing all physiologic processes, including our brain reward processes, pleasure and pain, is to return to homeostasis. So what cannabis does, like with all reinforcing substances and behaviors, is it temporarily gets us out of that homeostatic balance and tilts toward our reinforcing side or our pleasure side or whatever, relieving pain. It's a positive experience. But in response, our brains want to restore homeostasis, and they do that by downregulating our anandamide and dopamine transmission, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels into this dopamine deficit state, which is craving, right? It's withdrawal, it's craving. It might be slightly outside of conscious awareness, but of course, it motivates us to want to reach for that drug again as a way to recapture that initial pleasurable response. And if we do that, then repeatedly over time, that initial deviation to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but that after response to pain gets stronger and longer. In other words, the process of neuroadaptation is a progressive one where we essentially can end up in a chronic dopamine deficit state where we've reset our hedonic or our joy set point. We've so bombarded our reward pathway with this highly reinforcing substance that in order to compensate, our brain has developed a new normal where when we're not using, right, we're in this dopamine deficit state, which by the way is exactly like depression, right? It's too little dopamine. It's below our homeostatic baseline. And once we reach that point, now we're entering addicted brain. Now we need to use not to get high, but just to feel normal. And in order to get high, we need to use ever greater potency and quantity type forms. So that's we begin to chase our tail. What initially is problem solving becomes the problem itself, but we don't see it. And I think that's really the key, that we don't see this causal relationship between all of the pot we're smoking and feeling more depressed, more anxious. All we know is that in the moment, we're relieved of our anxiety. And of course, that control piece is a big part of addiction too. It's like, well, I might be more miserable, but at least I can fine-tune control when I'm miserable and when I'm not. And there's a big pull with that.
How has marijuana changed over the years?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure as your listeners have heard many times, the pot of today is not the pot of yesteryear, and that these plants can be genetically engineered to have variable content of certain active ingredients. THC is the active and addictive and psychotropic or mind-altering ingredient in cannabis. CBD is not addictive. And you can genetically engineer a plant to have more or less of one or the other. These are these different strains. And what's happened now is that people have gotten into the business of engineering the cannabis plant to have very high content CBD. I mean, sometimes that too, CBD, but THC is really what most people are going for. And then you have different ways of kind of, processing the plant and also the resin. So you get this dabbing with the resin, which is sort of like the most potent part of the potent THC plant. The result being that some forms of cannabis now have 90% THC, whereas in the 60s, it was at most 10% THC. The other big change with cannabis today is, of course, we have these sort of vaping delivery mechanisms, right? So, even without having to go through the bother of like manipulating the plant to roll a blunt or a spliff or something, you've got these cartridges that people can sort of suck on all day long. So you've got increased access through the engineering of the delivery mechanism. And then you have changes in cultural norms where people have come to regard cannabis as safe. They see it as medicinal. They see it as not harmful. And what you have today, what data show is that whereas in the 60s, people who used cannabis would use it on the weekends with friends, but not like during the week. And what we're seeing more and more now is daily cannabis wake and bake users. So they start in the morning, they use all day till they go to bed. So not just higher potency, but also these more rapid delivery mechanisms, and then a culture that has sort of contributed to normalizing all day, everyday use.
So is it safe to say that marijuana in general is not good for the health of our brain?
I can say that with pretty good confidence. First of all, smoking anything is bad for us. So the edibles are a little bit of a harm reduction strategy, but most people don't want to use the edibles because of the delayed onset of action. And then cannabis is just definitively addictive. Now, I wouldn't want to say that there's no situation in which it's useful. So there is reliable evidence that short-term cannabis can help with, AIDS and chemotherapy-related nausea and vomiting, AIDS and chemotherapy-related anorexia, and spasticity in the context of multiple sclerosis and other neurodegenerative disorders, as well as short-term pain. So those are good evidence. The problem is, just like with opioids, what works short-term doesn't necessarily work long-term. And there are no studies supporting use of cannabis for any medical indication long-term. So again, all of these things, when used in the right way, in the right context, including cannabis, although I would say cannabis, the plant, is not FDA approved for any medical indication. It's some of the active derivatives, and smoking is not FDA approved for any medical indication. But the actual, THC has been shown to be effective short term for these medical conditions, but not any psychiatric conditions.
I would imagine that it's even harder sometimes to come off of something like cannabis or even like alcohol because it is so normalized in society that there are people that can have a healthy relationship with both of these substances, as you alluded to earlier. And the person, I'm sure, goes like, why can't I do that? Right? Why can't I have a healthy relationship with cannabis or with alcohol and so many other people around me can, right? Because you don't really have that conversation with like heroin and cocaine. It's not like, typically people don't really have healthy relationships with either of those drugs, right? Those tend to be something that you get addicted to fast, and it's a very, very fast progressive deterioration of your life, right? If you're doing it every single day. And with all that said, alcohol is also very normalized, and you'll hear people say, well, marijuana is safer than alcohol, or, a marriage has never been ruined because of alcohol, or people aren't likely to, kill somebody in a car accident, or whatever the example is when they're on marijuana compared to alcohol. What are your thoughts on the differences in as far as in addiction and how they impact the brain between marijuana and alcohol?
Well, again, all reinforcing substances and behaviors work on the same reward pathway, lead to this, dopamine release, followed by this progressive dopamine deficit state. So really, there are more similarities than differences. I mean, I think the sort of societal association between alcohol being more dangerous than cannabis has to do with the fact that for some people, alcohol is very disinhibiting. And so it can lead to public drunkenness and drinking and driving and other harms, not just to the individual, but harms to others, which society gets alarmed about, right? It's one thing if you're deciding to do something to your own body, it's another thing if you're now intoxicated and acting out in a way that's harmful. However, I would say that depending upon the person, you can have potentially just as much other harm with cannabis as you can with alcohol. And again, there's enormous individual variability, but this idea that cannabis is harmless because really you're just kind of smoked out, sitting on the couch, motivated, not bothering anybody, is turning out to be less and less true, especially with these more potent forms. So we have people who are now, driving under the influence, and we know that it affects reflexes. It affects people's likelihood of getting in a motor vehicle accident. Maybe it's not as bad as alcohol in terms of those parameters, but it's actively being studied now. And I'll be curious to see what the evidence shows, because it could be that it's just as harmful to use cannabis and drive as it is to drink and drive. The other thing is that people often forget the extent to which cannabis is a powerful psychotomimetic, meaning that it can make some people really, really paranoid. And paranoia is considered to be one of the few psychiatric emergencies. So, paranoid ideation, suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation. When people get paranoid, they do really crazy things. They harm themselves, they harm other people. They just engage in scary acts because they feel that they're in danger. And we see this all the time with cannabis, especially in people who have an underlying sort of propensity for paranoia or psychosis, people with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, some patients with bipolar disorder. Some of those folks, when they use cannabis, their underlying disorder just completely takes off. Our antipsychotic medications don't work. Psychotherapy doesn't work. So, I mean, I think it's almost like a cultural trope that, cannabis is safe and alcohol is not, because we're seeing more and more societal and individual harm as a result of cannabis today.
How does cannabis and marijuana impact like kids differently than adults, if anything? I mean, I've as a personal trainer, I've coached a few kids over the last, or young adults over the last few years that have ended up having psychotic breaks due to excessive marijuana use. And I have a lot of parents that listen to the podcast, and I would imagine that, unless people are like studying the science and they're up to date on all the stuff regarding marijuana, they might just see marijuana as something, as the same kind of potency and the same type of substance that they may have used or seen being used when they were growing up in an earlier point. Is there any differences in how marijuana impacts like a teenager or young adult's brain versus somebody who's like my age at 35?
Yeah, I remember I was at dinner about 15 years ago with one of the administrative leaders of Stanford. And I was trying to, engage him in a conversation about the dangers, the growing dangers of drug use on college campuses, including growing dangers with cannabis. And he just completely dismissed it. He was a child of the 60s. And he said, I drank, I smoked pot in college. That was part of a rite of passage. That's what young people do. They're out there experimenting. It's no big deal. And, you're just trying to you're a party pooper. And he didn't use those words, but that was essentially the message. But what people don't realize, especially I would say people of that generation, what they don't appreciate about this generation of young people is the extent to which young people have incredible access to highly potent drugs of all kinds, and that polypharmacy has become the norm. So people who use cannabis don't just use cannabis. They're using MDMA, Molly, they're using psychedelics, they're binge drinking, they're shooting up heroin. I mean, and it's all over the world, including in elite prestigious college campuses. The other thing we're seeing is many, many more young people who use in isolation. And this is really, I think, one of the scariest things about it. It's not like it's like a bonding experience. These people are going home to their rooms in their parents' homes or to their dorm room on campus, and they're using by themselves. And so this kind of loneliness and progressive isolation, and it's just devastating. It's devastating because many college campuses do not yet recognize the extent to which drugs and alcohol are accessible, prevalent, potent on college campuses, and incredibly destabilizing for building any form of community.
So if somebody is listening to this and they've smoked or used marijuana a lot, or a parent has a kid that has, and let's just say that they've become aware of this and they want to change, they want to get better, and they're thinking to themselves, am I going to be this way forever? Is my brain going to be like permanently damaged or destroyed? I mean, what's the path like as far as like healing the brain to become like, I guess, more normal after excessive marijuana use?
Yeah, so there's lots of reason for hope. The brain preserves enormous plasticity throughout life, but especially when we're young. One of the early interventions that we do is we ask people to abstain from cannabis products for 4 weeks as a way to reset reward pathways, get dopamine firing back up to healthy homeostatic levels. We warn patients they're going to feel worse before they feel better. Those first 10 to 14 days are excruciating, but if they can make it to 4 weeks, what they'll notice is they get out of that craving vortex. They're able to see true cause and effect. Usually symptoms of anxiety, depression, insomnia, dysphoria, craving are much, much better. They're able to be more present, to take joy in other things. They're more connecting more to other people. And so, there's plenty of reason for hope. And a lot of times this experiment of kind of dopamine fasting or abstaining for 4 weeks gives people a lot of information on just how addicted they become, on how much better they feel not using, on how what they thought was helping their depression and anxiety was actually making it worse. So there's enormous plasticity, lots of reason for hope. People can change behaviors at any stage of life. And because cannabis tends to not have a life-threatening withdrawal syndrome, unlike some other drugs, people can stop it and kind of go cold turkey. And if they can endure it, they can get to a place pretty quickly where they feel a whole lot better. So that's sort of the first stage that of sort of entering into exploring a recovery lifestyle or an abstinence-oriented lifestyle. But even if the long-term goal is moderation, cannabis, in moderation, the way to get there is to start first by abstaining for long enough to reset reward pathways, and then to be very intentional about what they'll use, how much, how often, and also accountable and honest if it doesn't work, so that if they're not able to moderate after a period of abstinence, they can be more embracing of abstinence as probably the best option for them. And a lot of times what we talk about too is kind of reframing abstinence not as a sort of self-denial, but actually as a self-affirmation, as a way to be your best self, to live your best life, to really do yourself a favor. Um, so those are kind of some of the things that we talk about.
What do you recommend to people who are trying to recover from marijuana addiction, so that they can have a decent experience through the withdrawal process?
So, addiction is a biopsychosocial disease, so that requires biopsychosocial interventions. We have some medicines that can help people with cannabis withdrawal. They're tricky to use in their own right, but they can be useful tools. In terms of the psychosocial, spiritual pathways and principles can really help people. Prayer, meditation, those have been also shown to increase dopamine. So they're a way to access healthy levels of dopamine. Peer support, getting support from others. And then I also recommend what's sometimes referred to as hormesis. It's a branch of science showing that intentionally doing things that are hard, like exercise or ice cold water immersion, especially in states of craving or as preventative, can really help people with short-term withdrawal. So I strongly recommend that people engage in those painful activities that are more painful than the pain of withdrawal as a way to actually get through the pain of withdrawal. Now, I'm not talking about cutting or other self-harm. I'm talking about the right level of physically challenging experiences through exercise and ice cold water plunges and other, yoga, tai chi, taekwondo, whatever, all of that sort of the embodied meditation can be that too. Prayer.
What do you think are some of the biggest risks that maybe people might be often overlooking when consuming cannabis and marijuana?
The biggest risk is probably very mundane, which is that if you're high and you drive, then you put yourself and people around you at risk. In that regard, it's really not any different than any other intoxicating substance. And that's not really specific to the mechanism through which cannabis works. However, my colleagues and I have been studying cannabis effects in people, and particularly the main psychoactive alkaloid called THC. Many people will have heard of this. And we found that if you infuse THC into healthy people, that they may get paranoid or have altered sensory experiences, things like that. And if you give THC to people who have schizophrenia, then you make their psychosis worse. So the idea that THC is completely benign is not accurate, which is that if you smoke enough cannabis, get enough THC into your system, then some people are going to have problems with paranoia, psychosis, delusions. And by psychosis, I mean hearing voices, seeing things, having false beliefs that seem real at the time. I think many people who have used cannabis recreationally may recognize in themselves or others periods where they or other people seem to feel very anxious and uncomfortable, worry that the police might be out to get them or something like that. But if you notch that up a level, it can be a real problem.
Yeah, there's a lot of research from what I've read about the relationship between cannabis and THC and their increased risks of like psychosis and stuff, specifically among men. Like, what does it do to the brain that would cause something like that?
You know, the more we study, the more we learn. I would say that cannabis affects the ability of the brain to tune the circuitry so that on cannabis, communication in the brain gets a little noisy. This kind of loss of tuning of brain activity would be like having your radio become very staticky. The messages don't quite come through in the same way. We see this in people who get other kinds of drugs like ketamine or who have schizophrenia, where the brain circuits are not that well tuned. And, you know, I think for most people, most of the time, it's not that big of a problem. You know, where people drink alcohol or engage in other activities don't optimize the function of the brain. It's a problem if you try to do your schoolwork. It's a problem if you try to drive your car. It's a problem if you're solving really important problems. And it may be a problem that goes beyond the time that you're using the cannabis if you're a teenager. In other words, if young people who have developing brains are using these substances, there are some data that suggests that it can affect brain development, data from humans, but also from animals where they can control all the potential confounding factors pretty carefully. And it turns out to be one of the few things that people who are at risk can do that actually increase their risk for later psychosis or symptoms of schizophrenia if they happen to be vulnerable to the disorder.
And so, what are some of the risk factors, in your opinion, that could lead to somebody developing some sort of psychosis or schizophrenia from excessive cannabis or marijuana use?
First, probably everybody has some vulnerability point. In other words, if you use enough cannabis, almost everybody can get to the point where you have some symptoms of psychosis transiently that go away after the drug effects wear off. We know that the heritable risk for schizophrenia is very complicated. So there are hundreds of genes that have a tiny effect on the risk of developing schizophrenia. And most people in the population have some of these risk genes. Some have a lot of them, or risk variant, gene variants. Some have a lot of them and are at substantial risk of developing schizophrenia. Other people have very few of them, you might say are relatively protected. But since we don't know, we don't screen everybody in the population to determine what's called their polygenic. It means the combination of many genes. Since we don't screen people for their polygenic risk for schizophrenia, we really don't know who among us is at relatively more risk or relatively lower risk. I mean, we know that if they have schizophrenia in their family, maybe they're, in that way, they're a little bit higher risk. That's only relevant for a small percentage of the population. So without really careful genetic testing, we don't really know who's at risk, and that's the problem. Cannabis, for someone who's at high risk, is like walking out in a field of landmines. Everything looks fine until you have a bad experience and have some difficulty bouncing back from it. So I think people who are at risk may be sensitive to low effects of lower doses of cannabis and may have more adverse and or persisting effects of regular cannabis use.
And so I guess what you're saying is the only way to guarantee that you won't develop that is just to be sober or abstinent from it, correct?
Yeah, I would say that there are things you can avoid and things you can't avoid, right? You can't avoid your genetic makeup. And oftentimes you can't avoid stresses in your life that may make it a little harder. But I would say that if you've had some bad experiences on cannabis, that should be a warning. It's hard to tell young people who want to try everything out in the world that's available to them, never try cannabis, never try alcohol, never try cigarettes. I mean, we can say that, but I don't think many teenagers will listen to us. But we want them to listen to their own experience. We want them to pay attention to themselves. If they have trouble regulating their drinking, have a bad experience on alcohol, we want them to watch out for alcohol. If they have a bad experience on cannabis, we want them to watch out and avoid cannabis. Pay attention to the signals that their own body's giving them. and protect themselves from getting into difficulties later.
Any advice for parents to help their kids develop self-awareness around their habits with these substances?
I think it would be great for parents to have the same kind of discussions with their kids that we're having right now. I don't think that they need to go into the details of the polygenic risk for schizophrenia and the hundreds of genes that may be like sleeping time bombs that and all of that. I think that just makes people upset and afraid. But they can talk to their kids about paying attention and looking out for themselves and for their friends who may have difficulty. A lot of teenagers don't really want to listen to adults about this, but they may listen to their classmates or friends, or particularly older friends, and hear the message that they have to be careful, particularly if they have a bad experience with these substances.
And so would you say that kids and adolescents are more at risk to develop some sort of psychiatric disorder from cannabis or marijuana versus, say, an adult who's over 25, 30 years old?
I would say that the stimulation of these kinds of persisting psychoses is a young person's problem primarily. It's not that regular cannabis use isn't associated with problems in older people too, but they're a little bit different. So for example, in adults, what you see more is that people who are vulnerable to anxiety may have panic attacks triggered by cannabis use. People who are using cannabis all the time may find that, or when I say all the time, I mean many times a week, that they may feel more likely to feel depressed or hopeless about things, or not very motivated to be engaged with their friends or colleagues at work. That's a more subtle effect, an important one as well, but the one that really, I think, makes people like myself who studied psychosis very concerned about are these syndromes that, psychosis that may not always go away when people stop using the cannabis.
Have you found anything that's on the more holistic, natural side, whether it be exercise, meditation, et cetera, that could help give people the same type of effect that the cannabis might be giving them?
I'm really glad you raised this point, because I think a healthy lifestyle is good for you no matter what you're struggling with, whether it's heart disease, whether it's depression, whether it's diabetes. The kinds of things, you might say that in a way, depression is a whole body disorder. Anxiety can be a whole body disorder, because there are disease-related processes in your body, often called inflammation. The same thing that contributes to your coronary artery disease might be contributing in your brain to depression. Healthy diet, exercise, good sleep, an active as opposed to a sedentary life. All of these things are helpful as people deal with anxiety and depression. Sometimes cannabis use can make things worse because it can be a part of a sedentary lifestyle. So hanging around, sitting on the couch, using a lot of cannabis, spending your day that way, doesn't get you to exercise, doesn't get you out with people, doesn't get you to, everybody knows about the munchies. It may not get you to a healthy diet. And all of, so I think overall the treatment of anxiety and depression probably begins with a healthy lifestyle that's augmented with psychotherapy and maybe medications if needed.
Going back to psychosis as it relates to marijuana and cannabis, like let's just say like that somebody is in a state of psychosis, maybe they're receiving psychiatric care, they're in some sort of medical setting. What does the healing process look like from there? I mean, or is it not reversible?
Well, for most people, it's reversible. I mean, for most people, it's probably every big city in the United States, every weekend, you have people in the emergency room who are having a psychotic or severe anxiety episode on cannabis. And for most people, just letting them sober up is enough. But for the people who have persisting psychosis, they need more support. I mean, there are many reasons that a person might have a more pronounced psychotic response. Maybe they don't have schizophrenia, maybe they have a vulnerability to manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder, or maybe they have a history of severe trauma and had a psychotic episode related to reliving their traumatic experience during cannabis exposure. So there are a lot of ways that people can become more psychotic on cannabis or have a more persisting psychosis. So most of these problems are just handled at home, right? So most people who have a bad experience in cannabis, the family will stay up with them until they settle down. But the main thing is to make sure that there's follow-up. So if a person has a really bad experience, particularly if they're having persisting unusual experiences, unusual thoughts, that somebody's looking out to make sure that they can get connected for more support. You know, for many people, that may involve starting antipsychotic medication if they're really having persisting psychosis.
So have you found that excessive cannabis use and getting into a state of psychosis can lead to developing things like bipolar disorder?
Well, these are more epidemiologic data. I mean, so what happens is that when we work at the personal level, the individual level, yes, I've seen many people who had a first episode of a psychiatric problem, severe anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. In that context, I can't really tell whether the cannabis is causing the problem or making it worse. But the large-scale epidemiologic data are the data that we rely on that suggest that there is some increased risk for psychosis among people, persisting psychosis among people who use cannabis extensively. And it's one of the few things that does it.
Why is marijuana seem to be so psychologically addictive for people?
I think that there are a couple of reasons. One is that people are stressed. People are under just amazing amounts of stress. It's hard for a lot of people just to get through the day. And some people make it through the day, but are so riled up from their day that they can't relax when they get home. And so cannabis has become one of the ways that people relax. It can be more of a problem if the anxiety about going to work or the tensions of work make people get high before they go to work. Because sometimes, particularly if they used a lot of cannabis, they won't perform very well at work and they can get themselves into a negative cycle. But I think, number one, we're becoming more and more aware of the impact of anxiety and depression of the lives, inadequately treated anxiety and depression. That's just a natural setup under times when we're under so much stress for people to compulsively use cannabis. The second thing, and this I think is true about almost every addictive drug, which is people may start using cannabis for all kinds of good reasons. I can't sleep, I can sleep on cannabis. I feel tense around people, I can relax with cannabis. They have all kinds of great reasons why they started using it. And then when they use it very regularly, it's basically one thing, which is it's a habit. When they anticipate being under a stressful situation, instead of taking a deep breath and going for a walk, they look to the cannabis. When they can't sleep at night, instead of counting to 10 or deep breathing, or instead of turning off their cell phone, their mobile phone a half hour before they go to sleep, turning off the TV, giving themselves time to relax, they use cannabis. They're sometimes using cannabis habitually and short-circuiting their own natural capacity for resilience. Cannabis addiction, like any addiction, there's just the pure addiction part to it, which is it becomes an automatic part of your life, and you use it in ways that may not be adapted.
Have you found anything either in research or in your clinical experience that's been effective for people when they're having a stressful day and they need to do something in that moment to help them self-regulate?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole field of psychology that helps people get in touch with themselves and learn how to relax and practice that. Yoga, meditation, mindfulness. These are examples of strategies. Going out for a walk, getting a cup of coffee just to talk to other people. There's so many ways that people can adaptively cope with the stress. One of the great stressors, one of the great things that makes life so much more stressful is feeling isolated and cut off from other people. And getting together and being around other people is really important part of this resilience process as well.
I would love to know your thoughts on what marijuana exactly does to the brain when it's ingested.
Ooh, that is a complex question, but just on a basic level. So, marijuana consists of many components, and the cannabinoids, and we can talk about those like THC, when we consume it, it will bind to our endogenous cannabinoid receptors, and those receptors on different cells will change activity of those cells. And when we think, for me as a neuroscientist, what it does is that it can, for example, impact on our acutely on our working memory, our motor coordination, but the cannabinoid receptors are throughout our bodies. So, so there are many different things that it can impact when we consume it. But in large part, also, the reason why people take it recreationally is that it can make people, feel quote unquote relaxed, depending on the amount, rewarding, high, euphoria.
And so, do you believe that, and when we're talking about marijuana, I guess we're talking about THC specifically, do you think that it has the ability to change people's brains over time if the use is strong enough?
Yeah, so a lot of the research that I did initially in terms of how I got started looking at cannabis and in particular THC. So when we talk about cannabis especially from an addiction perspective, we're talking about THC, since we know that's a cannabinoid is associated with the reward, the high. We can see that repeated use of cannabis, and especially high potency cannabis, meaning high concentrations of THC, does change the brain, and it changes the brain in different ways. So it can change how the activity of the cells, it can change the structure of the cells, actually the morphology of those cells, and the connectivity of how different our brains are obviously are never silent, and that connection between different cells and different brain regions, cannabis can impact on that, even not just on the short term, but we see it even long term. And that's where some of my studies looking at like the developmental effects of cannabis, where we study the brains much later after their initial cannabis use.
What have you found on the developmental brain? Like, what has the research suggested as far as like kids who smoke marijuana that has a lot of THC in it? Like, what have you found that happens to their brains like later on in life?
Yeah, so I was saying, one of the reasons I went down this path to start with, a crazy path, was the old adage of like this gateway hypothesis. Like, if you smoke cannabis as a teen, you're going to end up, going to other addictive or hard drugs later on. But I just wanted to know, was there a neurobiological issue, aspect to that? Because of course, there were a lot of debates, and there still is. And so using our animal models, where we can get, really control all the variables with humans that make it challenging to interpret some of the human data, when we give THC to, say, our rat models as adolescents and then study them later in adults, we could see that they were much more sensitive to opioids, so they would self-administer more opioids. They showed greater impairment of decision making, risky behavior, especially if they were re-exposed to THC again in adulthood. And we could also compare that to adults who have a cannabis use disorder, and see that there were very similar things in their decision making, their risky behavior, their impulsivity. And so the developmental effects we could, in terms of the adolescent exposure to THC, and especially high dose THC, we could see also increase their sensitivity to stress. So, so it's not that animals and people go around looking, quote unquote, for lack of another word, crazy just because they had adolescent exposure to THC. Often it's what happens to them in their lives. So there are changes in the stress responsivity, so that yes, they're going around normally, but they encounter certain stress, and then they showed much greater impulsivity with that, or risky behavior, changes in their decision making, their reward sensitivity. And we could even see that their stress hormone, the corticosterone or cortisol levels in humans, was much more elevated. We could also see that it impacts on the activity of certain cells in the brain. And so we know that it has a long lasting effect, even if the person, did not use the cannabis again for a long while.
So would you say the main danger of kids who are using high potency or using marijuana that contains a lot of THC, the main danger is that it impacts their ability to manage and deal with stress, and then so later on down the road, they've trained their brain to deal with stress using a substance, and then once more stress happens, once that substance, the novelty or the high kind of wears off, they're now forced to go into something more severe, such as opiates, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a one-to-one that the person is going to go in and start, using heroin and become addicted to heroin because of that. But you said it perfectly in the context of a lot of our patients with a cannabis use disorder. They will tell us they use it for dealing with their anxiety. But all the data shows that the more they use, the more they exacerbate and they worsen their anxiety disorder, the less they're able to actually deal with stress. So they are inadvertently worsening the damage. And the higher the THC content that they use, the more their brains change in a manner that you can say limit how the buffer that they have to deal with stress, to cope. And then they go back to the drug because then they're like, oh, this had helped. But it helps acutely. And I think people mistake intoxication for anti-anxiety, that it's actually not alleviating their anxiety. They're just getting intoxicated. And they're two different things. But I will also say, even in our animal models, there are behavioral traits, personality traits that actually not everybody who gets exposed to THC will develop certain things that we see later on. We're still trying to understand, obviously that individual differences, but in large part, we do see that this greater sensitivity to reward, not being able to buffer stress as much, being much more anxiety sensitive. Also, cognition being impacted, especially under those conditions.
Not to play the blame game, but I'm trying. I would love to just try to get your thoughts to help my audience maybe understand, like, who's more at risk for developing cannabis use disorder, who's more at risk for developing some sort of addiction to cannabis that could result in potential psychosis and stuff. Have you found that, based on the data that you've seen, maybe people you've talked to, have you found that the environment will determine whether or not somebody becomes addicted to cannabis, or do you believe it's like the substance, high potency THC in itself?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, again, most of the data epidemiologically, even in preclinical animal studies, is that the earlier you're exposed, the higher the concentration of THC and the frequency of use, the increased frequency, they do increase your vulnerability. Just like cannabis, for other substances of abuse as well, cannabis is no different, meaning environment does matter. So we do see that individuals that had, traumatic early life events, they're much more vulnerable to later, cannabis use disorder. But you see that, as I said, with other substances. And for me, it pains my heart because, the abuse or the trauma that a lot of children may experience, that gets encoded obviously into cells that then makes them much more vulnerable. And it comes back again to this whole aspect of stress sensitivity. But there are many people who also experience a similar environment who do not go on to develop a cannabis use disorder, even if they may be exposed to cannabis. But there are other things often in their lives that can buffer some of that. And so, the question for us is, again, the individual differences of why certain individuals may be able to be more resilient, overcome some of those stressors. But the environment definitely plays a really huge is a really huge factor, that together with perhaps aspects of genetics, when we think about people who are, develop psychosis. But even with the psychosis, we see this increased frequency or incidence now of psychosis, but it's linked a lot to the potency of the THC. So in Europe, they've done, I take Europe more than the US, where US is definitely much more cannabis available. But even in Europe, yes, it's growing, but there you could see and really track that the increased THC potency they showed in, different cities, increased psychosis in young people, even if you may not have quote unquote a genetic risk. So it's this multifactorial complex aspect of the environment, THC potency, and that people are getting exposed to this high potency THC younger. And the younger you are, the greater the vulnerability to develop the cannabis use disorder.
Talk about the endocannabinoid system. Am I saying that right?
Hmm.
Okay. And then what it's responsible for in the brain, why ingesting, smoking, eating various forms of THC marijuana is so appealing to that. And then talk about, if you could, because I've heard you talk about this, like some natural ways that we could tap into that same system that could give people like a similar feeling, things like meditation, I think I've heard you talk about.
Yeah, so our endocannabinoid system consists of the receptors to which THC binds, for example, but also it's not there for cannabis. It's not there for THC. It was there for our endogenous, you could say, cannabis ligands, these chemicals. And these chemicals are much lower in their in the I would lack of another word just because of your audience, like the potency with which they would bind to these cannabinoid receptors. So when we consume a lot of cannabis, our cannabinoid receptors actually go down, right? And so the cannabinoid receptors, they regulate our endogenous cannabinoid system. They're very powerful. They're there for maintaining homeostasis in the brain. So when you think about the endogenous cannabinoid system, they regulate how cells communicate. And if something is too high, it kind of helps to bring it down. If something is too low, it helps to bring it up. So we maintain normal, and I'm going to emphasize normal balance, normal homeostasis. So when we impact on our cannabinoid receptors, and also the more cannabis you take, the more you impact the natural endocannabinoid ligands that are synthesized, that are made. So you're impacting on your natural system, even though you say I'm taking because it's natural. So the question is, what is it that modulates our endogenous cannabinoid system so you don't need to take cannabis or other drugs? And, I'm horrible at meditation. I'm not good at it at all, but there are definitely things in which people, how do we bring ourselves back to homeostasis is basically it. How do we blunt the stress responses that we feel in life? And that's where our endogenous cannabinoid system, it does help in modulating stress, the normal stress response. So it is when people, mindfulness, meditation, what are the things that people can do to naturally bring themselves back in homeostasis? It means that you are engaging your natural endocannabinoid system, because that is what mediates it. So for me, I think the earlier we can even teach kids about mindfulness and meditation, it's less that they're going to go and try these drugs that they're trying to use to artificially do that. So bringing the body was built, or the brain was built to put things in balance, put things, so, and that's a huge aspect of the endocannabinoid system, of normalizing when things go off, but just on a regular level, communications between, the cells to keep us in balance. If I put it in a general, bigger, perspective like that, I can go very minutia, but not going to go into to that for your audience.
So if somebody's listening to this, and let's just say they've been using, and again, when we're talking about cannabis, we're talking about THC and marijuana. If they've been using it for a period of time and they're looking to bring themselves back to a level of homeostasis, do you believe it's still possible for our brain to still grow and heal through neuroplasticity, even though the potency of, even though the marijuana today is way more potent with THC than it used to be?
I absolutely believe it. I think when I started down a path in neuroscience, I didn't start studying addiction in the beginning, but as I started to look at the neurobiology of it, many people with a substance use disorder, they say, and I hate this adage of once an addict, always an addict. And being a neuroscientist and studying the brain related to addiction, I know that's false. And the reason I say that is one of the things that our data and other people have also showed is that what's happening to the brain when you have a substance use disorder and then use high potency cannabis, we're changing these tags on our DNA called these epigenetic tags. So epigenetics, and you asked the question earlier, Doug, about the environment. The environment can impact on, we inherit the DNA sequence from our parents, so genetics. And that determines how your cells communicate, obviously how we look and so on. The environment, and THC is one of them, and high dose THC can impact how the cells communicate, and they impact it by these epigenetic tags that are put on the brain so it remembers. It remembers the high potency effect. And so when you use THC again later, even if you hadn't had it for a while, you're much more sensitive to, like I said before, the cognitive impairing effects, the anxiety effects. Epigenetic mechanisms are reversible. You can't reverse your genetics. You can reverse epigenetic modifications that are put on the tags in the cells. And so for me, I know it's reversible because of what neuroscience has taught me. We just haven't completely found ways to do it in a safe manner. But because what THC is changing are these epigenetic tags, we can reverse them. And you can reverse them even with behavior. We know that. So environment can put tags on, but another environment can help to remove those detrimental tags. And so for me, it is reversible. And I do think that we will be able to find ways to help people, whether it's through behavior, whether it's through meditation, whether it is through, positive aspects in their life, whether it's through another medication, we will be able to reverse that.
But getting back to some of the solutions for recovering from cannabis addiction, cannabis use disorder, what are some of the systems that you believe somebody should work on strengthening? If somebody, let's just say, is like day one in recovery and they're like, all right, I want to do everything I can to modify my behavior and change so that I'm not seeking out substances like cannabis to help me numb pain, manage stress. What kind of activities should they be focusing on and stuff like that?
That's a challenging thing because everyone is so different. And I think you have to go with what are the things that bring you joy. For some people, it is about, I do think I'm also this, in addition to meditation I'm bad with, I'm not going to say go run, I'm horrible at running, but for some people, they actually love running. And our natural endorphin system is an important part as well. How do we, if you've depleted something, how do you fill it back? And so to me, it is knowing that it is one day at a time, but positive things that come into your life. How do you try to bring back natural joy? How do you try to bring back things that alleviate the anxiety? Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important that people understand that they're not alone. And it is to find whether it is group therapy or groups may have common interests or individual therapy in order to help them. I think one of the things being isolated is usually not a great way to overcome, you know, substance use disorders. And that's no different for cannabis use disorder. Finding the positive people, making sure to try to avoid those with whom you had used before with. Those are cues and triggers to use again. So, it's important to also be honest with oneself. Why am I going down this path? And it is challenging, but it's possible. Many people have done it. So when people think again about addiction that you can never get out of it, that's not true.
Do you think people are better off given the sometimes the shame and stigma that can come with like cannabis addiction, because for so long it was seen as this lower tier drug, that they're better off going into a cannabis specific like 12-step group or support group? Or do you think that it's more accepted now in like traditional 12 steps?
I think it's more accepted now, and I think because they have seen the shift of these high potency THC that people are, getting addicted faster. They're showing many of the same signs as other substance use disorders. So I think, to me, it's to start with whatever is available. It's just to take that first step. And then you go to, as you go down this path, you start to go more and more into the one that you see that works more for you. Trust me, there's no disorder on the that we ever say that there's one treatment for and that's it. Yet still for substance use disorder, we think, oh, it's just this and then you'll be fine. No, everyone will be different. Everyone got into this path, into this disorder in a different way. And to get out of it, you have to realize you will get out of it also. You don't have to follow every single thing that everyone else did. There are different programs. And if one doesn't work for you, try the other. If this doesn't work, try the other. Everyone is different. So know that, if one thing didn't work, you're not a failure. It's that thing that didn't work for you. Something else will work.
One of the challenges I think people have is they get super excited to start this recovery journey, and then all of a sudden the novelty of that kind of wears off, and they start to get a craving. They start to think about like, oh, maybe I can go back and use and do it recreationally, and that can become hard. And then and as a result, people end up going back to it. What do you recommend people do when they get like a craving or they get some sort of thought where they're like, maybe I should just go back and try it differently this time?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, again, like many disorders, most disorders are relapsing disorders. And there's not a shame, but you have to, as soon as you recognize these urges and are coming through, it is about reaching out to those people who can be honest and open, and also, again, when you isolate yourself, that makes it worse. So again, do the things that can give you more access to people who, I said, in a positive manner. It is going to be normal when you realize it's normal that these thoughts will come in. It is normal, even for people who are, I'm addicted, to it is to chocolate potato chips. I'm not going to eat this, it is normal. We're human. It is what you put as buffers for yourself. When you know that you are starting to slip towards the edge, what buffers do you put there? You identify, you have those buffers in place before you even get to the edge. So, like I said, the therapist, your physician, whichever physician you may have, whether it's a psychiatrist or whatever disorders you might have, the friends, the family members who are positive, it's getting people who believe in you and won't give up on you, and that you don't give up on yourself. But to me, it's to do the things that give you pleasure, that are not drug things, so that when you do get close to the edge, they're already there, that can help you from going over that edge.
Shifting gears just for a second, there's a lot of people obviously that are struggling with opiate addiction now. And there's been this massive opioid epidemic now for years. And one of the things I've seen is that people will say, well, smoking marijuana or ingesting marijuana is a great form of harm reduction. And then I've also talked to some experts that are like, no, it's not. If it works for somebody and they're doing it legally and blah blah blah, great. But you can't just paint this as this universal way for people to reduce harm from opiate addiction. Like, what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, again, people I think that we have all the answers. We don't know if cannabis, and especially this high potency THC cannabis, is definitely not the answer for opioid addiction. However, cannabis with low potency THC, yes, you're not going to overdose as the risk is for opioids. We are, as you said, in an opioid epidemic still. That 130 people still die daily. So we do need to protect people, and all the harm reduction strategies must be considered. But it's important to know that just consuming these high potency THC is not the answer either. It's still to do it within their harm reduction programs. There's still a lot of research being done in regard to cannabis in terms of harm reduction strategy for opioid addiction. So we'll see whether or not they work and for who they may work for. That's another thing, as I said earlier, everybody won't be able to come out of their substance use disorder in the same exact treatment. So cannabis may work for some individuals, but I'm going to emphasize decrease the amount of the cannabis of the THC potency. We also know in some research that people think that they need the high potency THC. Some of the low potency THC that has CBD, cannabidiol in it, actually can be better for you than the high potency, can help. Our research that we had shown many years ago, and that's why it started, people thought, oh, cannabis can help with opioid addiction. It was CBD. We showed first in our animal models, it decreased their heroin seeking behavior. We moved it to humans in small studies. We showed that it could decrease their cue-induced craving and their stress response. And now we're conducting a larger study on that in the real world, because before people would come to our labs, and now we're going to look at them in their real world. So we will see whether or not CBD can be developed as a treatment for opiate use disorder, but it's CBD, not cannabis. So again, you need to educate yourself about what you're putting into your body and what you think you're using to alleviate your disorder. Cannabis, high potency cannabis, so far has not been proven to treat, cure anything. So it can exacerbate all the things that you are trying to alleviate.
Why has marijuana become so dangerous in today's society?
Well, this is an important question that I bump into almost accidentally when I was doing my PhD in around 2008 up to 2012, when I started collecting data, and I should say in South London, which is where I work both as a clinician and an academic. And we were running a study of young adults experiencing psychosis for the first time, and also a group of healthy volunteers from the same geographical area. And so it was a classic case control study. And my role in the study was to collect a detailed cannabis history. And for the first time in this type of study, to actually ask people what type of cannabis they were using. And it was a good time because the Home Office in UK in 2008, so when I was just about in the middle of this data collection, decided to do the first potency study. So they wanted to see if the concentration, particularly of THC, delta 9, tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD cannabidiol in the type of cannabis available on the streets of London around that time have changed compared to early 2000. And two papers came out at that time that began to suggest that the potency of herbal cannabis, that in London we will call skunk because of the strong smell coming out of it, was actually steadily increasing, and it was around 60% THC, plus minus a standard deviation of 4.8. And the other important thing is that the concentration of CBD was declining, and it was in some of these skunk sample almost undetectable. And that was very interesting to me because when then I got to analyze my data that represented people using cannabis at the time when this potency study has been carried out, what we did show was that people who reported using skunk, and particularly using skunk every day, had up to a 5-fold increase in the probability of suffering a first episode of psychosis compared to people who were not using cannabis or had never used cannabis, I should say. But also, this risk of the skunk daily users was strikingly higher as well of people that at the time had been using hash or resin. And this was important because the same Home Office study had shown that the resin around that time in London was actually quite a low concentration of THC, around 4.5%, and that it had an equal ratio of CBD. So you had the same amount of THC and CBD. And so in our data almost mirrored how when people reported using hash had a very different risk profile in terms of the chances of developing psychosis compared to the skunk users, even when you control for all other possible drugs associated with psychosis and many other social environmental risk factors that we know are associated with psychosis. And we also looked at the background role of the genetic of schizophrenia. And even when we took that into account, you still had an independent effect of what we started calling high potency cannabis, especially in frequent users.
So would you say that the massive increase in mental health problems caused by cannabis, and when I say cannabis, I'm talking about specifically marijuana, would you say that the main culprit in that is this higher potency of THC, or is it marijuana in itself?
Well, I think it's a difficult question to answer because we think that we know everything about, you call it marijuana in the state, we call it cannabis, and I think in this case we intend the same thing. But we tend to think that cannabis starts and ends with THC and CBD. But actually, we now know that there are at least 144 compounds. People also talk about the entourage effect, which is down to other compounds which are not cannabinoids but terpenes. And I think there is very little research, including for my group, from my group or other group in the States, that have actually done the same level of research associated with THC and CBD with these other compounds. So what I can tell you is that certainly I think the increase in concentration of THC and the decline of CBD has contributed in the increase of psychotic-like effects associated with cannabis, because we do know from people like Professor Cyril D'Souza from Yale, and people from UK like Amir England, Paul Morrison, and Philip Maguire, that if you give intravenous or even you get to inhale THC to healthy volunteers, you can provoke psychosis. I mean, you and I probably, if we were exposed to intravenous or certain concentration of THC, we would develop transient paranoia and potentially even auditory hallucination, which are characteristic symptoms of psychosis. So we do know that THC is associated with that. But we do not know, for instance, if delta 8 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is different from delta 9, that is the classic THC, in certain concentration can produce exactly the same level of psychosis. We do not know if other cannabinoids like THCV would also do that, and many others which I'm not even going to name. And what is the balance between all these cannabinoids in the samples that people buy, both from legal places, like more likely to be in the States, or from the drug dealer, which is more likely to be the case still in UK. So I think there is more than we need to know than what we do know.
Like, as far as like, somebody might be listening to this or they're watching this, they're a parent, they're trying to like be more mindful of what their kids are doing. Like, is there a certain amount of cannabis that when it's consumed, it can certainly, you've seen in research, like cause psychosis, or is it dependent upon each individual?
Well, studies, like including the one I've been involved in, they look at groups. They don't look at an individual level. So in the study we have carried out, we've shown that type of cannabis with a THC equal or greater than 10% are likely to significantly increase the odds of developing a psychotic disorder. But again, there are people out there who would consume less than that and develop psychosis, as well as there is a majority that will use more concentrated types and might not develop a clinical condition. So what I usually say, so in my clinic, I do this at an individual basis. So we haven't yet developed, like for alcohol, unit. So in alcohol, you can, again, although the unit refer to the general population, you can say, well, this is the amount of units that in general is safe to use depending from age and gender to prevent liver disease and liver cirrhosis. And now we also know that even units are not perfect. So one, with cannabis, we're far away from getting to units. There's some work, and I can give you some names of people that are leading on their work to define the minimum amount of cannabis, which is a safe use in terms of THC alone, which will compare potentially an alcohol unit. But we don't really know that yet. I normally say to people, you can try. So with my patients who have become psychotic in the context of cannabis use and who are very keen on not giving up cannabis completely, we do what you call harm reduction. So they steadily reduce until they get to a point where we do see an improvement in the psychotic symptoms, but they can continue to get some of the pleasurable effects that they are seeking from cannabis. And this is an extraordinary individual journey. And I can give you the example of a gentleman who had been using 9 joints of skunk for an equivalent of probably 12 grams a week for 20 years, and then went in and out of hospital over these 20 years, 15 times under a compulsory admission. And the last time he was discharged, with his family, decided he wanted to try and make a change to his cannabis use. And he agreed to go down to 3 joints a day. And, 3 joints a day can be a huge amount for some people. But for him, because of his previous use, his level of tolerance, they were enough to keep him away from psychosis and functioning. There are some people for whom half a joint might be enough. And I'm an example of that, not in relation to cannabis, but of alcohol. Doesn't matter how much I drink, I get very sick because I have a genetic mutation, which is the alcohol dehydrogenase mutation that people from the Far East tend to have, which makes, for me, alcohol very toxic. So I don't enjoy even a shandy or a very low alcohol concentration drink because I will get sick, headache, and vomit. So not much benefit for me to drink. So you can imagine that in cannabis, there'll be people like me for whom even a small amount of THC can trigger unpleasant psychosis. And there will be people for whom this is a very high concentration. And there might be people that don't develop psychosis at all. Doesn't matter how much cannabis they take.
Is psychosis and what you're talking about, is it reversible? And if so, like, how do you go about helping your patients overcome that?
So that's a wonderful story, because even before we get to my clinic, which is why I was able to develop it, because we had this evidence, we did know that and there have been meta-analysis, many longitudinal studies showing this, that if you develop psychosis and you continue to use cannabis following the onset of your psychosis, your clinical and functional outcome, which means the persistence, severity, reoccurrence of your psychotic symptoms, is much worse than the people that stop using cannabis. And also your ability to return to things relevant to you, job, relationship, studying, and so on. So we do know that if you take cannabis out of the equation, you can really make a huge impact on the outcome of these young adults. So on the basis of this, we thought to develop this service where if people were willing to engage with us, we could support them in reducing or stopping their cannabis use. And what we have found so far, and we are at the beginning of developing our service, is that 80% of people are actually able to completely stop using the cannabis, and 20% go down from daily use perhaps to just a weekend social use. And for all of them, you have a significant reduction in psychotic dimension. So both what we talked about, so ideas, so paranoid dimension, as well as auditory hallucination experience, although those are less common, but very importantly, level of functioning. So we had that the striking majority of them went back to paid employment. A proportion of them went back to voluntary work, and the youngest group went back to education. And they were also much more able to look after themselves and regain independent functioning. And this was within a short period of time. This didn't take a decade. Our work spans around a 20 plus weeks of one-to-one weekly session. And so we saw these positive outcomes on average after 3 months of working with us. And some of these people were discharged from mental health services back to their primary care work. So I think what is very important is that there are risk factors for psychosis you cannot reverse. You cannot reverse obstetric complication. You cannot cancel out trauma. You can, of course, do therapy to elaborate and overcome some of the consequences of your trauma. But you can reduce or stop your cannabis use. And we do know that that has a powerful effect on the outcome of psychosis, which is why I feel with my colleagues very passionate about giving these people a chance to see it for themselves. So I'm not there to tell them this is going to happen. It's for them to work it out with time, that they do experience a change in the way they feel and in the way of they can achieve what is relevant to them.
I don't know if we touched on like the mechanism in which cannabis causes psychosis. I know we talked about the elevated THC content. We talked about dopamine. We talked about different risk factors. But what is it about cannabis? Like, what does it do to the brain that causes psychosis? Is it that it attaches to like the dopamine receptor and it just gives the brain a massive rush of dopamine and that leads to psychosis? Like, what is it about it specifically that leads to that?
It is much more complex than, for instance, for substances like amphetamine or methamphetamine, where you have a direct interference with the dopamine system. So if you take amphetamine or methamphetamine, you would actually increase suddenly the dopamine release and availability of dopamine via the dopamine transporter and the dopamine receptor. Cannabis does not have a direct impact on neither the dopamine receptor or the dopamine transporter. Cannabis compounds that we know what they're up to, and particularly in this case, THC, what we do know is that THC binds the endocannabinoid receptor, both 1 and 2, so CB1 and CB2 receptor. Now, the endocannabinoid receptors are part of a system called the endocannabinoid system, which develops with the brain from very early stages of the brain development before birth. And it has a very important role, not only the brain, but I'm going to talk about the brain primarily, because it's a protective system by which we produce our own endocannabinoids. So we produce compounds that bind to the CB1 and the CB2, and in the brain regulates the release of two main neurotransmitters, GABA and glutamate. And what you want to know about GABA and glutamate is that one is the accelerator of the brain, which is glutamate, and the other is the brake of the brain, that is GABA. And they accelerate and they brake on the dopamine system as well as other systems. And what the endocannabinoid system does with the two compounds we produce, anandamide and 2-AG, which are endocannabinoid, is modulate the transmission of GABA and glutamate when this is needed. So endocannabinoid are not produced all the time. But say I suffer hypoxia at birth, or as an adolescent, I fell off my bike and bashed my head and I have a brain injury. At this point, the brain, the neurons will release endocannabinoid, and the endocannabinoid will modulate GABA and glutamate release to allow the brain to compensate for the hypoxia and for the brain trauma to do with me falling off the brain. So it is a system which is considered neuroprotective because it's activated on demand when there is a mechanic or, if you like, a chemical injury to or threat to the brain. So what THC does is that it binds to the same receptor. So is a agonist, partial agonist to the CB1 receptor, which means that it sits on it, blocks it, but at the same time stimulates it, and has got more affinity than our own endocannabinoid. So if we're smoking THC, THC binds this receptor and doesn't allow anandamide of 2-AG to bind the receptor and work in the way they normally do to protect the brain. But more importantly, they alter the production of GABA and glutamate. Now, because GABA and glutamate downstream, they regulate cannabis release, what happens is that you have a dysregulation of dopamine. So it's a very complex fine tuning which cannabis disrupt, which is why it's very rare that people have a joint and blomp into a very acute psychotic episode like you have for methamphetamine and amphetamine, unless they are particularly probably biologically very sensitive. Is a more subtle process, the one of developing paranoia, and often interplays with other risk factors and the surrounding environment. So it's a quite complex story, but it's a story of disrupting a wonderfully fine-tuning system, which is the endocannabinoid system, which is there to protect our brain functioning.